Imagine a lone U.S. sniper in the middle of a jungle where even your own heartbeat feels too loud. Yet he survives 3 days against impossible odds, using nothing but a rifle and a rusty soup can. No backup, no technology, no visibility. And somehow, he takes down 96 Japanese soldiers with a trick that shouldn't have worked in any universe governed by logic. Today, you're about to discover how a worthless piece of ration trash turned into one of the strangest and smartest battlefield inventions in American history. A trick so wild, so against every rule of military doctrine, that it rewrote the fight for an entire unit trapped in the Pacific jungle. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, hit that subscribe button to support the channel, and drop a comment telling us, Bandang lamiva danger do zem video nai. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Alright, let's step into the jungle, where a soup can became deadlier than any sniper school ever imagined. July 1942, northern Luzon, Philippines. The jungle was so thick it felt alive, a breathing wall of vines and wet soil. Private Thomas Rourke lay flat against the ground, cheek pressed to the stock of his Springfield. The smell of mud and crushed leaves fused into his uniform. His heartbeat wasn't fast, just controlled, tight, like a man who had already accepted he might die today. 30 yards ahead, the undergrowth shifted in tiny, almost invisible tremors. Not footsteps, something lighter, practiced. Japanese scouts. Rourke steadied his rifle. The scope fogged at the edges from the humidity. Wiping it was pointless. Within seconds it would blur again. Visibility in this jungle wasn't measured in yards. It was measured in heartbeats. You saw the enemy only when he was close enough to kill you. He exhaled, the breath trembling not from fear but from calculation. Every sniper rule he'd learned back in the States, spot first, shoot second, relocate third, had collapsed the moment he stepped into this island. Sound didn't travel here. Leaves swallowed it whole. Even disciplined Japanese infantry moved like ghosts through the wet brush. They could be 10 yards from a man and he'd never know until the knife touched his throat. 2 days earlier, Rourke's reconnaissance team had been cut down because they never heard the ambush coming. The memory stuck with him. The sharp, silent flashes of movement, the sudden screams, the jungle closing over everything. Now he was alone, separated, hunted. That would have broken most men. Instead, it forced him to notice something peculiar. A discarded soup can from his sea ration pack had rolled near his hide. When a weak breeze swept through, the can rattled with a faint metallic tremor, just enough to tickle the edge of Rourke's focus. When the wind shifted again, brushing the leaves, the can vibrated at a slightly different pitch. He froze. Not wind, movement. He repositioned the can on the barrel of his rifle, tightened it with a strip of torn sling leather, and waited. The next tremor was sharper, directional. Something or someone had brushed the vegetation off to his right. He turned his rifle not toward what he could see, but toward what the can told him. The shot cracked once, echoing, swallowed instantly by the canopy. A body thudded into the brush. Rourke didn't smile. He only adjusted the can by a few inches, already reading its tiny shivers like a field instrument no manual had ever mentioned. For the first time in this suffocating jungle, he wasn't blind. He had a way to hear the enemy. And by the time the Japanese realized it, Rourke's soup can trick would already be rewriting the odds one silent kill at a time. The northern Luzon jungle in 1942 wrapped around Rourke like a living creature, pressing against his senses with a constant heaviness that made every breath feel borrowed from the island itself. The canopy formed a choking ceiling of tangled branches and dripping vines, turning daylight into a muted green haze that distorted distance and made even familiar shapes feel hostile and uncertain. Every patrol sent into this region understood that the Japanese had mastered its silence far better than the Americans, who still relied on sightlines, footsteps, and textbook doctrines that evaporated in the humidity like ghostly traces of another continent entirely. Rourke's unit had been reduced to scattered fragments after days of ambushes that materialized from foliage so dense it seemed to birth soldiers from pure shadow, leaving the survivors shaken by an enemy who understood invisibility not as a tactic but as an instinct. The terrain offered no reliable vantage points, only depressions filled with damp leaves, spiderwebs clinging to rifles, and low ridgelines that concealed movement instead of revealing it, forcing American patrols into narrow channels where the Japanese funneled them with unnerving precision. The heat pressed down with such relentless weight that even veterans felt their discipline eroding, as sweat blurred vision, stung eyes, and softened their grip on weapons already slick with moisture and grime. Every inch of ground demanded attention because roots twisted underfoot like tripwires, and the air vibrated with insect swarms whose droning blended seamlessly into the background hum that masked all human presence. In these conditions, a single misplaced sound could expose a man, yet the jungle itself produced so many confusing noises that identifying danger became an exhausting puzzle, with fatal penalties for hesitation. Japanese patrols moved through this nightmare landscape with a confidence that bordered on supernatural, using narrow deer trails and forgotten logging paths to drift around American positions and strike from angles that defied predictable geometry, reinforcing the belief that they could hear and sense things beyond ordinary human capability. Their scouts operated in small teams that coordinated through hand signals and subtle rustling cues, creating the illusion that they appeared and disappeared at will, leaving Rourke's remaining comrades constantly paranoid that every bush concealed a hidden rifle or a bayonet waiting for a quiet lunge. As Rourke crawled deeper into the undergrowth, he felt the weight of this imbalance pressing on him more heavily than his pack, because the ordinary rules he had relied upon during training provided no answers for an environment where visibility collapsed into a fog of leaves and soil. American doctrine assumed a battlefield with open sightlines, dry terrain, and predictable engagement ranges, but here, the jungle erased every advantage of marksmanship and replaced it with chaotic proximity, where instinct mattered more than precision. The Japanese exploited this mercilessly, advancing in staggered groups that blended with the terrain until the moment of attack, using the natural muffling of the forest to mask their footsteps and coordinate assaults without betraying their positions through sound. Rourke knew that without some method to reclaim even a fraction of situational awareness, his chances of surviving more than a few hours would taper into nothing, just like the men whose rifles he had recovered from the mud after earlier ambushes. Yet the soup can on his barrel, crude and improvised as it was, offered a fragile foothold against this hostile world, a mechanical ear that compensated for the jungle's tendency to blind and deafen its intruders. It gave him something the forest had stolen from every soldier before him: a direction, a hint, a warning carved from the faintest vibration of shifting leaves. And although he could not know it yet, the can would soon transform this suffocating terrain from an enemy he feared into an ally he could finally understand. The deeper Rourke pushed into the jungle, the more brutally clear it became that every sniper principle drilled into him during stateside training was collapsing under conditions no instructor had ever imagined or prepared him to overcome. His rifle felt steady enough in his hands, yet the air's heavy moisture clung to the metal and fogged the scope so persistently that he often wiped it only to watch the blur return before he could even reacquire a target. The Springfield's precision meant nothing when visibility shrank to a few tangled yards, turning every shot into a desperate guess rather than the deliberate, patient craft he had spent months perfecting. Even the sound discipline he relied on evaporated because the jungle swallowed noise with an eerie efficiency that made footsteps, whispers, and even gunfire blend into a single dull hum that concealed friend and foe alike. Rourke realized that practical marksmanship depended not just on steady aim, but on reliable sensory cues he no longer possessed, leaving him effectively half-blind and half-deaf in a battlefield designed to erase certainty. The Japanese, meanwhile, excelled in this environment because they moved with astonishing subtlety, using the soft soil and layered foliage to glide between shadows without leaving a trace that a conventional sniper could detect or interpret. While American doctrine assumed open fields, predictable engagement distances, and clear flanking lanes, this jungle twisted every assumption until the manual's advice felt like a cruel joke written for another planet, where light, air, and terrain behaved in familiar, cooperative ways. Rourke remembered his instructors emphasizing patience, discipline, and clean lines of fire. Yet here, patience became dangerous. Discipline meant little without awareness, and clean lines of fire existed only in fantasies, detached from the suffocating reality around him. He crawled past rotting logs and dense curtains of vines that shuddered unpredictably with insects, birds, or nothing at all, leaving him to question every flicker of motion and every faint tremor reaching his fingertips. What troubled him most, however, was the unnerving ability of Japanese patrols to exploit his uncertainty by closing distance without revealing direction, often striking from angles his scope could not cover without noisy repositioning that risked instant exposure. He sensed they had learned to identify and manipulate the jungle's acoustic blind spots, using misdirection and terrain to mask coordinated advances that caught snipers like him completely off guard. Each failed attempt to anticipate enemy movement deepened his awareness that the traditional rules of camouflage, observation, and timing were powerless in this hostile ecosystem, which seemed determined to protect the very soldiers trying to kill him. As he lay motionless beneath low branches that brushed against his helmet, Rourke accepted with painful clarity that survival required embracing the environment rather than fighting against it, because conventional tactics offered no foothold against an enemy perfectly adapted to the terrain. He needed a method to compensate for his sensory disadvantages, something that allowed him to reclaim even a sliver of directional awareness in a place where vision failed and sound misled. That realization settled heavily in his mind, pressing harder than the jungle heat, reminding him that without a new tactic born from necessity rather than doctrine, he would soon disappear into the undergrowth, like so many fallen scouts, whose final moments left no trace except the silence that consumed them. The days preceding Rourke's lonely crawl through the jungle had carved deep grooves of exhaustion into every surviving American soldier, because each patrol seemed to vanish with terrifying speed, leaving behind only scattered equipment and the lingering smell of gunpowder drifting through the humid air. The remnants of his reconnaissance team had watched one squad disappear in less than a minute when a concealed Japanese unit erupted from the undergrowth, striking so precisely that none of the Americans managed to fire more than a single desperate shot. Another team attempting to flank the enemy line suffered a similar fate when muffled detonations swept across the ridge, sending bodies tumbling into the ravine before anyone understood which direction the attack had come from. Rourke remembered the look in Corporal Henderson's eyes after they found Private Malloy's helmet lying beside a pool of darkening mud, because the sergeant knew the jungle had swallowed another man without leaving a trail or even a final cry to mark his passing. The unsettling silence following each engagement weighed heavily on Rourke, who felt the world around him tightening like a noose with every mile they advanced into territory where the Japanese controlled the shadows as easily as they commanded their rifles. Even the veterans who had endured earlier campaigns whispered that this island changed men, not through brutality alone, but through the oppressive uncertainty that followed them like a second skin. He recalled the night their perimeter collapsed, when Japanese infiltrators slipped past their sentries and ignited a brief but devastating firefight that shattered the unit's cohesion and forced survivors to scatter in multiple directions, turning the dense forest into a maze of terror where any movement risked betrayal by snapping twigs or panicked breathing. The chaotic retreat left several wounded men behind, their faint calls for help drowned by rising gunfire, forcing Rourke to confront the grim truth that rescue was impossible without condemning more soldiers to death. As he crawled through foliage thick enough to hide entire platoons, he carried those unanswered voices in his memory, feeling them echo each time he paused to slow his breath and listen for enemies he could not see. Perhaps the most haunting moment occurred when Lieutenant Avery, a respected officer known for his steady composure, stepped onto a seemingly clear path and crumpled instantly as a single, expertly placed shot cut through the air and struck him before he managed to speak a warning. The men dragged his body behind a fallen tree, but the shock of losing their calmest leader fractured their confidence so completely that several younger soldiers trembled uncontrollably during the next approach march. Their nerves were stretched so thin that even harmless rustling from monkeys or drifting branches sent rifles snapping toward phantom threats, reminding Rourke how quickly fear distorted judgment in a world where danger blended seamlessly with nature. All these memories pressed on him as he lay in the undergrowth, because each loss deepened his understanding that the jungle was more than a battlefield. It was an execution ground designed to exploit uncertainty, punish hesitation, and reward only those who mastered its strange rhythms. Rourke realized that without reclaiming even a fraction of control, he would soon join the countless Americans who had vanished in silence, remembered only by the men who witnessed the jungle tighten around them like a closing fist. Yet even as despair crept along the edges of his thoughts, the faint tremor of the soup can on his rifle reminded him that he still possessed one fragile, improvised tool capable of shifting the balance, if only he could learn to harness it before the enemy struck again. As Rourke studied the jungle with a growing sense of reluctant respect, He realized that the true enemy was not merely the Japanese soldiers stalking him, but the catastrophic mismatch between American doctrine and the unforgiving physics of the environment enveloping every inch of this island. The marksmanship rules he had memorized with confidence back at Camp Roberts were built upon assumptions of open terrain, predictable fields of fire, and stable atmospheric conditions that allowed carefully controlled shots to dominate engagements through pure skill and discipline. Here, however, the dense vegetation refracted sound and distorted light, turning straightforward tactical principles into unreliable guesses that faltered whenever humidity thickened or a breeze shifted through the canopy. Every attempt to judge distance through the scope became a gamble, because layers of overlapping leaves created illusions of depth, making targets appear closer or farther depending on how sunlight filtered through the branches at any given moment. Even the most experienced sharpshooter would struggle under circumstances where shadows moved contrary to wind direction, and patches of stillness concealed motion with deceptive ease. Rourke noticed that his rifle's recoil stirred clouds of fine dust that lingered unnaturally in the air, revealing subtle air currents he had never been trained to consider, currents that the Japanese seemed fully aware of whenever they maneuvered around American positions. What troubled him most was how sound behaved with a disorienting inconsistency that rendered traditional hearing-based detection nearly impossible, because the forest absorbed sharp noises, yet carried faint whispers across unexpected distances, tricking soldiers into misinterpreting direction and reacting toward false threats. Japanese squads exploited this quirk masterfully by coordinating attacks along acoustic blind spots, where even a well-trained ear failed to distinguish synchronized movement from the ambient chorus of insects, dripping moisture, and rustling branches. American doctrine treated sound as a dependable warning system, but the jungle twisted it into an unreliable cipher that only rewarded familiarity born from months of immersion, rather than formal instruction. Rourke also recognized how the terrain neutralized the advantages of rifles designed for longer-range precision, because engagement distances collapsed into chaotic proximity, where reaction speed mattered more than perfect aim or textbook stances. The Springfield's accuracy, prized during training, became almost irrelevant in situations where targets appeared suddenly at extreme angles that forced him to twist his body unnaturally, scraping against roots and stones that disrupted his firing posture. In contrast, Japanese soldiers wielding lighter, shorter weapons thrived in these close-quarter encounters, moving with fluidity that made them seem almost engineered for the terrain, while American soldiers struggled to adapt without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The humidity also undermined mechanical reliability in subtle but dangerous ways, coating metal surfaces with moisture that affected bolt operation and causing ammunition to gather sweat-soaked debris whenever magazines brushed against the ground. These environmental intrusions chipped away at the consistency American doctrine relied upon, turning each shot into a negotiation with variables far beyond a soldier's practiced control. Rourke understood that no manual could compensate for the jungle's capacity to shift conditions instantly, forcing him to improvise solutions through intuition rather than standardized procedure. As he lay beneath a low curtain of vines, feeling the soup can vibrate faintly against his rifle barrel, he accepted that the Army's expectations no longer defined survival. Instead, the environment itself dictated new rules that demanded creativity, awareness, and unconventional thinking. Doctrine had failed because it assumed stability, but the jungle offered only chaos, rewarding those who adapted and punishing those who clung to familiar methods. Rourke knew he could not change the battlefield, yet he could reshape his response to it, and the small trembling of the can reminded him that even the crudest improvisation could open a door that rigid training had left firmly closed. Rourke first noticed the strange potential of the discarded soup can during a brief moment of stillness when the jungle's relentless noise seemed to collapse into a single, fragile breath that carried more significance than any rifle shot he had heard that week. As he lay pressed against the soil, adjusting his grip on the Springfield, a faint metallic tremor reached him from his left, subtle enough to be mistaken for imagination, yet distinct enough to trigger a reflexive pause that stopped even his breathing. The can had rolled close to him earlier when he emptied his rations, and now it pulsed with a vibration that felt oddly purposeful, as though the jungle itself were trying to communicate through a hollow piece of discarded metal. He watched the leaves ahead shiver gently in a direction that did not match the can's faint rattling, which puzzled him because the movement suggested wind, while the trembling conveyed something heavier, more deliberate, like a foot disturbing the undergrowth beyond his line of sight. The realization came slowly. threading itself through his thoughts with a clarity sharpened by fear and instinct, convincing him that the can was responding not to breeze or chance, but to subtle disturbances carried through the tangled floor of the forest. He shifted slightly, letting his fingers rest against the metal, and felt the vibration again, gentle, irregular, unmistakably tied to movement in the brush that his eyes could not yet decode. It occurred to him that the can, being hollow and lightweight, might be more sensitive to these micro-tremors than any human ear burdened by tension and the jungle's thick, auditory haze. That insight struck him with surprising force, because it offered a means of regaining situational awareness without relying on sound or vision, both of which the environment had effectively stolen from him. Rourke began to rotate the can cautiously, aligning its open end toward different directions to test whether the pitch changed in response to shifting ground pressure or rustled leaves. Each minor adjustment strengthened his suspicion that the can functioned like a crude acoustic chamber, amplifying vibrations into detectable signals that hinted at enemy movement otherwise lost to the suffocating quiet. Driven by a sudden surge of determination, he tore a strip from his fraying sling and lashed the can to the barrel of his rifle, choosing a position that allowed the metal to resonate freely without interfering with the Springfield's action. The improvised device looked absurd, almost childish, yet the stakes were too high for pride to matter when every advantage, however unorthodox, promised another breath of life. He tested the attachment by shifting the rifle slowly, noting how the can responded with tiny oscillations that traveled through his fingers like coded messages delivered from an invisible frontier beyond the reach of normal perception. Moments later, the can trembled again, this time with a sharper cadence that suggested multiple points of contact along the forest floor, as though disciplined footsteps were brushing aside debris in a synchronized rhythm. Rourke felt the information travel through the barrel into his hands, guiding him toward a direction obscured by vegetation yet defined with enough certainty to influence his next movement. The jungle, which had stolen every conventional tool he depended on, had inadvertently given him a new one in the form of this humble can, transformed into an improvised early warning instrument. As he settled back into position with the rifle steady and the metal chamber shivering lightly in anticipation, he understood that this discovery marked a turning point far more significant than he initially realized. The can was no longer trash but a partner, offering him a primitive channel of communication with a battlefield that refused to reveal its secrets voluntarily. And in the tense silence that followed, Rourke accepted that this strange creation, born from fear, necessity, and stubborn intuition, might be the only reason he would see another dawn in this merciless jungle. Rourke knew the moment he tied the soup can securely to the barrel that he was violating not just regulation but a deeply ingrained principle every marksman respected, because altering a rifle's balance or profile risked compromising accuracy in ways that could become fatal under the wrong circumstances. The instructors back home had drilled this rule with relentless clarity, reminding recruits that the barrel was sacred and should never carry attachments not specifically engineered for combat. Yet as he crouched beneath the low branches, feeling the metal tremble like a nervous pulse beneath his fingertips, he understood that convention held no authority here, where survival depended on adaptation rather than obedience. He tested the rifle's weight by shifting his shoulders and adjusting his prone posture, noting how the can created a mild forward drag that slightly altered the weapon's natural settling point, but did not meaningfully disturb his ability to maintain a steady aim. The absurdity of the improvised device nearly made him smile, because it looked more like a child's science project than an innovation capable of rewriting battlefield dynamics in a jungle where even established technology struggled to function. Still, the can's subtle vibrations provided him with a kind of tactile radar that no military tool had ever offered, turning every faint tremor into a directional hint that cut through the uncertainty, haunting every movement he made. When he rejoined the remnants of his squad later that evening, their reactions ranged from disbelief to open amusement as they stared at the strange silhouette of his altered rifle and questioned whether hunger or fear had finally unhinged his judgment. Corporal Henderson, who had lost friends only hours earlier, shook his head with a grim chuckle and muttered that Rourke had officially gone bush-mad, a term whispered among exhausted soldiers to describe the psychological strain of prolonged combat in hostile terrain. Another man joked that the can would make it easier for the Japanese to spot them since it reflected light, though his attempt at humor carried an edge of genuine anxiety beneath the forced laughter. Rourke didn't argue or defend the decision, because words meant little until results proved their worth. and he suspected that desperation had sharpened his instincts beyond the point of self-conscious hesitation. The squad's reactions reminded him of how armies often resisted innovation until circumstances forced them to embrace ideas once mocked or dismissed, and he felt a quiet determination settle over him as he prepared to demonstrate the can's purpose. That night, the forest thickened with pressing humidity, and the darkness seemed heavier than usual, yet Rourke sensed a clarity within the shadows as the can trembled against the barrel like a tuning fork capturing whispers of movement. When the first Japanese scout approached their perimeter, the can shifted with a pattern far too deliberate to be wind, guiding Rourke's rifle toward a patch of brush still untouched by visible motion. He squeezed the trigger with complete confidence, trusting the tactile signal more than his limited sight, and the muted thud of a collapsing body silenced the squad's skepticism as effectively as any explanation ever could. The men froze, staring at him with newfound disbelief, realizing that the strange contraption had granted him awareness none of them possessed in the suffocating darkness. In that instant, the mockery evaporated, replaced by a mixture of awe and unease, because they recognized that Rourke had crossed a boundary between trained soldier and battlefield improviser, creating a tool so unorthodox that it challenged their understanding of what was possible. The can, once dismissed as trash or ration waste, had transformed into a silent partner guiding their survival, and even the doubters sensed that they were witnessing the birth of a tactic destined to shift the balance of their desperate fight. The night settled over the jungle with a suffocating density that swallowed even the faintest hints of starlight, leaving Rourke and the remaining men enclosed in a darkness so complete that it felt almost physical as it pressed against their skin and sharpened their nerves. Every breath seemed too loud, every shift of fabric too revealing. Yet the forest around them offered no cues to distinguish harmless rustling from imminent danger, because the Japanese scouts moved with a precision that blended seamlessly into the natural rhythm of the terrain. Rourke lay prone with his cheek against the cool stock of his Springfield, waiting for the soup can to speak in the subtle language he had begun to decode with growing confidence. For several minutes, nothing stirred beyond the soft murmur of insects and the distant drip of condensed water falling from branches high above, creating an eerie calm that felt artificially imposed by an enemy who knew how to weaponize silence. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the can vibrated with a tremor so delicate that he doubted his own senses until it repeated with a slightly sharper cadence, hinting at movement crossing a patch of soft earth rather than passing wind. He shifted the barrel by inches, letting the vibrations guide him toward a direction he could not visually confirm, feeling each faint pulse as though the forest were tapping out a coded warning directly into his bones. The men beside him held their breath as they noticed his attention sharpen with sudden intensity, though they could still see nothing through the thick mesh of vines and overlapping shadows. Rourke felt the can tremble again, this time accompanied by a subtle resonance that suggested multiple leaves brushing aside under cautious footsteps, and he understood with startling clarity that the scout was advancing from a blind zone they never would have detected through ordinary senses. The realization steadied him rather than alarming him, because the can's signals formed a pattern that revealed the enemy's approach with enough precision to justify action even without visual confirmation. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension flow from his shoulders into the ground beneath him, and squeezed the trigger with a careful firmness that reflected complete trust in the improvised device guiding his aim. The rifle cracked sharply, its muzzle flash briefly illuminating the jungle with a blue-white spark that vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the dense foliage. A half-second later, a muted thud echoed through the brush, unmistakably signaling a body collapsing into the undergrowth, and the squad reacted with a mixture of shock and disbelief, realizing that Rourke had fired without ever seeing his target. For several long moments, none of them spoke, because the reality of what had just occurred challenged every assumption they held about marksmanship and battlefield awareness in this impossible terrain. Henderson slowly raised his head, scanning the darkness for shapes that refused to appear, finally whispering that he had heard nothing before the shot, no indication of movement or threat except the abrupt end delivered by Rourke's bullet. The surrounding jungle, usually quick to mask disturbances, seemed briefly frozen, as though acknowledging the precision of the strike and reconsidering its own treacherous allegiance. As the silence settled again, the soup can gave one final tremor before resting still, almost as if signaling the completion of its first true test under fire. Rourke allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, not out of pride, but from the realization that this crude device had granted him the edge he needed to survive in a battlefield that defied traditional logic. The men around him watched with a cautious respect, understanding that they had just witnessed an impossible shot made possible by a scrap of metal and a soldier's refusal to accept the limits imposed by his environment. Through the long hours that followed the impossible shot, Rourke felt the jungle tighten around him with a predatory patience, as though the forest itself were waiting to see whether his strange new method could withstand the full weight of an enemy, determined to flush him from the shadows. The Japanese, realizing one of their scouts had vanished without a trace, began sweeping the terrain with renewed precision, advancing in staggered formations that probed every ridge, ravine, and tangle of vines where an isolated sniper might hide. Each step they took seemed measured against the quiet dread radiating through the American survivors, who understood that detection meant certain death in a landscape where escape routes were illusions and cover evaporated under concentrated pressure. Rourke's world shrank to a narrow tunnel of focus defined by the faint tremors humming through the soup can attached to his barrel, which had now become an extension of his senses rather than a mere improvisation. The vibrations changed character as multiple enemy elements fanned across the slopes, producing layered pulses that revealed their maneuver patterns with startling clarity, allowing him to anticipate angles of approach long before visual confirmation was possible. He fired sparingly, choosing only the most threatening targets, and each shot removed another piece from the enemy's tightening net, while reinforcing the squad's mounting belief that this odd invention might actually shift the balance of the fight. By the end of the first day, they had already repelled several encirclement attempts, relying on Rourke's uncanny ability to identify weak seams in the approaching lines and reposition the group before the Japanese pushed through the foliage. Exhaustion settled heavily on their limbs, yet the fear of being overrun fueled a stubborn determination that kept them moving from one crude hideout to another, always guided by the can's trembling whisper that served as their only reliable warning system. Henderson, who initially dismissed the contraption as madness, now followed Rourke with unquestioning trust, treating each subtle quiver of metal as if it were a direct command issued by a seasoned officer. On the second day, the enemy intensified their pressure, shifting tactics toward coordinated flanking attempts designed to trap the squad inside a narrowing pocket hemmed in by steep terrain and thick brush. The soup can responded with frantic vibrations that rattled along the rifle barrel like an urgent alarm, revealing the enemy's approach from multiple directions even before footsteps disturbed the leaves. Rourke guided the men through a series of short withdrawals, each movement timed so precisely that they slipped through enemy lines minutes before the Japanese converged on the positions they had occupied moments earlier. The squad began to realize that without the strange device, they would already have been surrounded, overwhelmed, and erased beneath the dense curtain of vines. As the third morning crept over the jungle with a faint gray haze, the Japanese launched their most aggressive sweep yet, advancing in staggered teams that probed the landscape with disciplined coordination, intended to collapse every escape corridor simultaneously. Rourke sensed the complexity of their maneuver through the can's overlapping tremors, which pulsed with a chaotic intensity that forced him to decipher multiple threats at once, translating vibration into direction and direction into action. The squad followed his signals, shifting along ridges and depressions, with a precision that mirrored the enemy's own sophistication, turning the fight into a silent chess match played across a hostile board, where every misstep promised annihilation. By midday, the tally of fallen Japanese had risen far beyond anything Rourke once believed possible, not because he outshot them in the traditional sense, but because he outsensed them through a crude instrument no doctrine had ever considered. The three-day stand had transformed him from a lone sniper into the central pillar of their survival, guiding the squad's movements with an intuition sharpened by relentless pressure and the constant hum of metal against steel. And although exhaustion gnawed at his strength, he could feel the tide shifting ever so slightly, as if the jungle itself had begun acknowledging the strange alliance forged between a desperate soldier and a discarded ration can. By the time the sun dipped beneath the tangled canopy on the third day, the Japanese patrols had begun to show signs of mounting confusion, because their carefully scripted maneuvers kept unraveling at the edges, as though an unseen observer anticipated every angle before they committed to an attack. Rourke sensed this shift, not through triumph, but through the subtle changes transmitted by the soup can, which vibrated with increasingly disordered patterns that suggested hesitation from soldiers who normally moved with unwavering discipline. The forest, once echoing with purposeful motion, now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, as if the enemy were questioning the reliability of their own instincts within terrain they had previously dominated so effortlessly. The moment that truly broke the logic of the hunt occurred when a coordinated flanking team attempted to trap the Americans against a narrow ridge, advancing with a precision that should have guaranteed complete surprise. Yet the Soupcan signaled their approach long before they reached striking distance, producing a steady rhythmic tremor that matched the cadence of disciplined footfalls, spreading across dried leaves in a pattern too synchronized to belong to wildlife. Rourke guided his men 20 yards downslope, timing the movement with an accuracy that allowed them to slip through a temporary gap created as the two Japanese elements prepared to merge into a single killing formation. Within minutes, the enemy collapsed inward on an empty position, finding only disturbed soil where bodies should have been. This failure rippled through the surrounding teams, who began shifting erratically as though searching for an explanation that did not exist, unable to accept that a small group of exhausted soldiers had repeatedly escaped traps designed with meticulous care. Some units pressed forward too aggressively, exposing themselves to angles they normally protected with fanatical precision, while others hesitated at intersections of brush that had previously posed no tactical dilemma. Rourke interpreted this hesitation through the chaotic signals traveling into his palm, each vibration broadcasting panic that contradicted the rigid confidence the Japanese usually displayed under pressure. For the first time since the ordeal began, he sensed a growing imbalance in the unseen contest between predator and prey, realizing that the enemy's assumptions had been turned against them so thoroughly that their decision-making faltered under the weight of inexplicable failures. The Japanese had built their dominance on the belief that the jungle favored them, yet now the forest seemed to whisper secrets into the hands of a lone American who should not have possessed any tactical advantage in these conditions. Each misstep they made compounded the sense that their own terrain had betrayed them, introducing doubt into the minds of soldiers trained to trust instinct above all else. This psychological fracture became painfully obvious when a small Japanese fire team halted mid-advance after Rourke eliminated their point man with a single suppressed shot that seemed impossibly well-timed, causing the remaining scouts to retreat several yards while attempting to reorient themselves. The forest fell into a tense stillness that lasted several minutes, as if everyone on both sides recognized that the established rules of engagement had begun to unravel completely. When movement finally resumed, it lacked the confidence and cohesion that had defined earlier attacks, replaced instead by jittery adjustments that revealed their growing fear of an unseen force guiding the Americans' survival. Rourke felt the shift settle into his bones with a clarity that surprised him, because he recognized that the soup can had become more than an improvised sensor. It had become a psychological weapon, eroding the enemy's composure. The Japanese no longer trusted the jungle to conceal them, nor trusted their training to guide them, and that sudden rupture in certainty marked the turning point of the entire confrontation. For the first time, Rourke allowed himself to believe that survival was not merely possible but increasingly likely, because the logic that once favored the hunters now fractured beneath the weight of a simple metal can trembling with the truth of the forest. As the third night tightened its grip on the jungle, Rourke sensed through the soup can's increasingly frantic tremors that the Japanese had abandoned caution and shifted fully into a coordinated closing maneuver meant to crush the Americans beneath overwhelming numbers before dawn. The vibrations rolled through the barrel in overlapping pulses that revealed multiple teams advancing from different elevations, their movements synchronized with a determination that signaled this would be their final, uncompromising attempt to end the standoff. The forest around him vibrated with an almost living urgency, as though the trees themselves braced for the violence about to erupt beneath their tangled canopy. Rourke pressed himself deeper into the mud, aligning his rifle along a narrow depression where shifting shadows concealed his silhouette, and felt the can transmit the steady approach of one unit climbing from the south ridge with methodical precision. Another wave approached from the north, their footsteps masked so effectively that only the can's trembling exposed their presence, confirming that the enemy intended to collapse both flanks simultaneously and force the squad into a kill pocket with no viable escape route. Henderson crouched beside him, gripping his carbine tightly, eyes reflecting the dim light like a man prepared to make peace with the worst possible outcome. The Japanese began closing the last 30 yards with unnerving discipline, stepping in rhythm so controlled that the ground seemed to inhale beneath their boots, absorbing each movement into a tension that coiled between the opposing forces. Rourke realized that firing too early would reveal their exact position, yet waiting too long risked letting the enemy overrun them in a single devastating rush. The soupcan vibrated sharply, delivering a clear signal that one fire team had broken formation slightly, creating a temporary gap that could be exploited to disrupt the entire encirclement if he acted with perfect timing. He steadied his breathing, feeling the barrel settle into the crook of his shoulder, and aimed toward the unseen flank, where the vibrations formed a distinct pattern that translated into a mental map he trusted more than his eyes. His shot cracked through the night like a blade slicing open a taut rope, dropping the lead scout instantly, and halting the momentum of the southern advance with a sudden jolt of uncertainty that radiated through the surrounding brush. For a heartbeat, the forest froze in disbelief, as though the terrain itself were stunned by the precision of a strike delivered in blindness, yet executed with surgical certainty. The northern team, unsure whether the shot was directed at them, hesitated for a crucial moment, giving Rourke the chance to reposition his rifle and interpret the can's shifting tremors as the enemy attempted to regroup. He fired again, this time targeting another scout deviating from formation, and the second collapse sent a shockwave of confusion through the encircling line, fracturing the Japanese cohesion at the very moment they needed unity most. Henderson and the others seized the opportunity, unleashing controlled bursts that deepened the rupture and forced the enemy to retreat several paces while re-evaluating their approach. But the Japanese, driven by duty and desperation, pressed forward once more, rushing the ridge in a determined surge that threatened to overwhelm the thinning defenses. Rourke shifted positions rapidly, dragging his rifle through the mud while relying entirely on the trembling can to guide his shots, each vibration helping him anticipate angles the eye could not perceive in the smothering dark. He eliminated targets with mechanical precision, carving wounds into the advancing formation until their confidence faltered a second time, breaking the charge into splintered pockets of scattered gunfire and frantic shouting. As the echo of the last shot faded into the trembling foliage, Rourke realized he had not merely survived the encirclement, he had shattered its inevitability. The Japanese line, once poised to crush them, now lay in disarray across the ridge, their strategy undone by a single soldier wielding a discarded can like an instrument of war. And in that breathless silence, the jungle seemed to acknowledge the impossible, holding still as if witnessing the final turning of a battle no logic could ever fully explain. When the first hint of dawn finally pushed a thin band of pale light through the tangled canopy, Rourke realized with slow disbelief that the jungle, once poised to swallow him whole, now lay eerily quiet, as though exhausted by the relentless struggle that had tested every limit of his endurance. The air carried the heavy scent of damp soil and gunpowder, mingling with the faint metallic tang rising from the rifle he still clutched tightly, fingers locked in a grip forged by 3 days of unbroken tension. Around him, Henderson and the remaining men rose cautiously from their concealed positions, their movements stiff and deliberate, aware that the silence could still fracture without warning if any surviving Japanese soldier attempted a final, desperate strike. As the light strengthened, the outlines of fallen enemy scouts emerged between the roots and vines, scattered across the ridge in positions that revealed how thoroughly their coordinated assault had unraveled under the strain of confusion and miscalculation. The squad counted the bodies in stunned silence, tracing the path of their own desperate maneuvers through the broken vegetation and overturned brush, gradually understanding the scale of what they had survived. 96 Japanese soldiers had fallen during the 3-day confrontation, and although each shot had been fired with calculated necessity rather than triumph, the magnitude of the stand left the men in a quiet state of awe. Rourke examined the soup can still secured to his rifle barrel, noting the dents and scratches that marked each moment of desperate contact with the forest floor, as though the metal itself carried a physical record of the battle's shifting tides. The can felt strangely warm despite the morning air, and he realized that it had become more than a makeshift tool. It had evolved into a symbol of adaptability under circumstances where rigid doctrine offered no meaningful guidance. Henderson approached with a weary smile, acknowledging that the strange invention had saved all their lives, and the statement carried an honesty that required no embellishment. When reinforcements finally reached their position several hours later, the arriving soldiers were stunned to find the squad still alive, entrenched in a defensive pocket that should have been impossible to hold against such overwhelming pressure. Officers listened carefully as Henderson described the improvised device, his tone carrying a mixture of respect and disbelief that reflected the surreal nature of their survival. Some commanders viewed the story with skepticism, Yet the battlefield's physical evidence supported every detail, and even the most doubtful observers found themselves reconsidering long-standing assumptions about the boundaries of battlefield innovation. Despite its extraordinary success, the soup-can trick never evolved into an official tactic, partly because its reliance on environmental quirks made replication uncertain, and partly because military institutions often hesitated to formalize methods born from improvisation rather than structured engineering. Still, the account circulated quietly among specialized units, passed as a story of ingenuity rather than doctrine, inspiring soldiers